thought he was going to come back to the room, so I grabbed the blood and put it all over me.
Mia Carrillo, an 11-year-old survivor from Uvalde, spoke to politicians about how she had to pretend to be dead so as not to be killed, smearing herself with the blood of her dead friend beside her. And the parents of one of those killed in Uvalde had a message for all parents in America.
Somewhere out there, there's a mom listening to our testimony, thinking, I can't even imagine their pain, not knowing that our reality will one day be hers, unless we act now.
Yet in the 23 years since Columbine, the 15 years since Virginia Tech, the 10 years since Sandy Hook, the 4 years since Parkland, nothing has been done by Congress. Following the Uvalde shooting, senators on both sides now seem to be hinting at possible legislation. But is change really coming? In today's forecast, we're going to speak to Matt Frei, our presenter, who spent years reporting on the United States, covering many presidential elections, but also, unfortunately, many mass shootings. And we're going to discuss America's obsession and its problem with guns.
This is one of those issues that divides the country so deeply and also divides America from the rest of the world.
From Channel 4 News, this is The Forecast. So, Matt, the Uvalde shooting, 19 children shot dead, 2 teachers killed. We had vigils, prayers, anger, frustration. And unfortunately, the same response from Congress, where they didn't do much so far. But here's a fact. Since Uvalde, 2 weeks ago, we've had more shootings in America. In fact, more than 700 people have died through gun violence in 43 of the 50 states. So what's more shocking to you? Is it the fact that an 18-year-old can go into an elementary school and shoot dead 19 children and 2 teachers? Or is it the fact that America keeps letting this type of thing happen?
I think both. I mean, I lived in America for 11 years, and the thing that punctuated my time in America weren't just, elections or big tornadoes or hurricanes, but it was school shootings. And, the first school shooting I covered was in Amish country, Lancashire County, Pennsylvania. Horse buggies, no TVs. The Amish community kind of dressed like, Germans in the 17th century. They read the Bible in German. They don't have mobile phones. They don't use any kind of gadgets, no cars. And in this sort of very, bucolic, very old-fashioned, ancient environment is a school shooter who walks into one of these one-room village schools and shoots 10 girls, and 5 of them die. That was really, really deeply shocking. And it was especially shocking because it happened in the Amish community. But in a sense, that collision of the weapons of modern war and, a determined killer up against the incredibly innocent victims of school children, schoolgirls, was what we see in every single school shooting that I've covered since then. And I tell you, I've covered far too many of them. They still haunt me.
But when we talk about the fact that that keeps on happening, the shootings, and they get worse, and they're now involving, younger and younger kids, Sandy Hook being the key moment. When you go back to those first shootings you went to, what was given as the reasoning? Because I remember recently watching Bill Clinton speak after Columbine in 1999, and he was sort of blaming video games, loner school kids. Do you remember what the reaction was back then when you first started reporting on this, and whether it's changed at all in terms of how Americans respond to this, the politicians especially, and trying to explain it?
So it depends entirely on your party affiliations. And actually, there's a really strong correlation between gun ownership and being a Republican and, being an advocate of gun control and being a Democrat. It's really quite stark. The pro-gun lobby will say, it's not the gun that kills, it's the crazy guy with the guns, the bad guys that kill using guns. And the Democrats will say, well, actually, the bad guys obviously have the intention to kill in many of these cases, but they're also given a weapon of war that makes them killing that much easier. Right? So you've got this seesaw between legislation that is introduced to restrict gun laws and then legislation that is then repealed either in court, or by presidents in order to open the gun laws again, make it more accessible. And what we're dealing with essentially is that we've come an awful long way since Bill Clinton introduced, the ban on assault weapons in 1994. And it is just now, despite incremental moves, up and down, it is so much easier to go into a gun shop or go into a gun fair or go online and buy essentially the kind of weapon you might use on the battlefield, but you should not be having under your mattress.
You were there for Sandy Hook in 2012. 20 kids, 5 and 6-year-olds, killed, 6 teachers.
Details are emerging every minute, and the picture that's being built up is one of a shooter going into the school, a primary school, so as you said, children between 5 and 10, at assembly time, so around about 9 o'clock this morning, and then shooting at dozens of people. Now, we don't know who the shooter was. We don't know why he did this. What we do know is that this is the largest number of school children ever killed in a school massacre.
Can you just remind me of what it was like to be there and to witness the lack of any legislation from Congress?
It was actually, I think it was one of the worst stories I've ever covered, and there's a lot of competition for that slot. And it started, we were in Washington that day, and when we initially heard the news, there was no indication of the number of kids that had died. But what we did hear almost immediately was a very tearful, deeply shocked President Obama give a special news conference, and he was on the verge of tears. He didn't give us the number of people who'd been killed, the number of kids, but he clearly knew that it was bad.
I know there's not a parent in America who doesn't feel the same overwhelming grief that I do. The majority of those who died today were children. Beautiful little kids between the ages of 5 and 10 years old.
And then, as we heard the number and we traveled up to Connecticut that day, to this beautiful little community. Sandy Hook is it's a lovely chocolate box New England town. To have that tragedy, that kind of tragedy in any community is beyond belief appalling. And of course, that's the thing about all these school shootings. There's such an extraordinary outrage against humanity, against civilization. And they produce such an extraordinarily emotional result on both sides. For me, as someone who really, has lived in America for over a decade, who really loves America. But this is one of those issues that divides the country so deeply and also divides America from the rest of the world. We don't get America and its infatuation with guns. We just don't get it. And we don't get the fact that in every other country, whether it's Norway after the appalling massacre of 77 students, or whether it's, Australia after Tasmania, or whether it's here, us in the UK after Dunblane and Hungerford, every time, in every other country, when there has been a mass shooting, the legislation has been tightened to make it more difficult to own guns, to make it more difficult to get a permit. In America, the exact opposite happens. Gun ownership goes up when there's a mass shooting.
Because people are worried.
Because people are worried that a politician will come along and restrict your ability to own guns. And that's the astonishing thing. Legislation that should be tightened is eventually loosened. So if you look at the vote in the House of Representatives, there were 8 different issues that they were voting on, all of which makes it more difficult to buy weapons of war and keep them under your mattress. Anyway, those 8 points, 223 voted to pass those gun laws, and only 5 Republicans voted with the Democrats, and 2 Democrats voted with the Republicans, 204 against.
And that bill was most definitely going to fail in the Senate.
It's going to fail because the Senate, which is divided 50-50, is not going to pass it. You need 60 votes in the Senate, as you know, a supermajority, to get that kind of stuff passed. Otherwise, it just gets lost in the filibusters and the long grass of filibusters.
Because after Sandy Hook, there was this chance to have a bipartisan Senate bill to try and introduce background checks. And it was sponsored by Joe Manchin, the Democrat, and it was sponsored by Pat Toomey, the Republican. It failed. But there is now talk, possible talk about something coming along. It won't be as radical as that House bill, but something coming along. We don't know if that will happen.
But the compromise...
Many people are pessimistic.
Right.
And it will be a compromise. But what's changed? If Sandy Hook doesn't convince you, what is it about this shooting, Uvalde? Is it that it's come after Buffalo? what's happening which makes some senators think they might want some movement here?
I think because they might feel that, the American public, even though it is split almost 50-50 on gun rights and gun control, the numbers have come down. So a few years ago, 67% of Americans were in favor of stricter gun control. That's now down to 52%, according to the latest poll, which is astonishing. I don't think that these horrible shootings of the last few weeks will change that dramatically. Because such is the tribal division of America, and we've said it before, Kieran, such is the division of America, which will be enhanced in the run-up to the midterm elections, right? That, with all the money thrown at advertising, and social media to kind of tick those various boxes, that there will be fundamental movements. So if there is a compromise in the Senate, and there may be, it'll be on really incremental stuff. I mean, this is tiny. This is small ball compared to the bigger issue.
To emphasize it just more is that we saw in the House hearings from one 11-year-old survivor from Uvalde, Mia, who talked about having to pretend to be dead and smearing herself with the blood of her dead friend. Does that kind of message not work anymore? Because, I mean, when you think about her surviving, there was only one survivor from Sandy Hook because every other person who'd been shot died instantly. Yeah. That was the power of the weapon. When we heard these hearings in the House, we heard from one doctor talk about how, these AR-15s, they left basketball-size wounds in 9-year-old kids. And yet you go to a vote and it's party lines again. Yeah. It's almost like, where does this go?
But what I'm trying to say, and perhaps I've said it badly, is that it is as if America views the same reality through two entirely different prisms. So for gun control, for those who are in favor of owning, of unlimited gun ownership, they do not see the problem in the gun itself. They see the problem only in the shooter.
Which is why they focus on the Republican side about school security, about doors.
But guess what? The Uvalde school, the Robb Elementary School, had the security.
As did Parkland as well.
As did Parkland. They had the security. Now you can what they want seriously is for the teachers to own guns. You have a pistol or a gun under your desk. What is so astonishing is that everywhere else in the world, people have understood that the more guns you allow people to own and the more powerful those guns are, the more people will die, either through suicide or homicide. And that message has just not got through to the American public, or at least to half of it. And it is the astonishing power of both the kind of sacrosanct nature of the Constitution that the Republicans are always very good at referring back to, the constitutional approach to all these issues, and the kind of brutal political calculations that go along with that. And it is, it's just very, very weird. I mean, I'll tell you a personal story. We have friends who live in Pennsylvania, and we stayed with these friends years ago when my kids were quite young. And one of their kids, who was really young, got a little scratch on her head running around the kitchen island. And there was a huge, hullabaloo. Someone was dispatched to hospital. It was a tiny little trickle of blood. But lying on the kitchen island were an AR-15, an M16, and an Uzi. Because our host, who was a wonderful chap, grew up in farming country, thought it would be really great if my son could have a go with these weapons of war. And I said, I don't think so.
So clearly what we have here is we have, on one hand, this issue of the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, being incredibly important to many Americans' their identity. On the other hand, we have those who are out there defending that and protecting it, mainly the gun lobby and mainly the NRA. Going back to history, after the assassinations of, JFK in 1963 and then his brother Robert Kennedy and then Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, Lyndon B. Johnson did try and pass some federal gun laws, which he did do, but they had to be watered down because of something called the NRA, the National Rifle Association. I mean, Matt, can you explain how fundamental that gun lobby is and how important they have been, especially in the last couple of decades, in terms of shaping this argument?
So essentially, the NRA, came into being as far as I recall, as a fairly small bore organization, put up there by the big gun manufacturers to say, come on, let's respond to these politicians who want to diminish our ability to own weapons. And that's good for our bottom line because we make these things. But it's gone totally beyond the issue of just the bottom line of gun manufacturers. This is about influencing American politics. And gradually, over time, the NRA became incredibly effective at making it very difficult for certain types of politicians to ignore the gun lobby. And it doesn't involve huge amounts of money. It's little drips and drabs, 5,000 here, 10,000 there, 15,000 there, all above board, it's all declared, to make sure that, certain legislation, is opposed. And then what's happened really with gun rights is that the whole issue has got into the bloodstream of American politics in a way where the NRA doesn't even need to push and prod. But it's almost as if they're irrelevant. If the NRA didn't exist, the issue of gun rights versus gun control would still be a defining factor of American politics.
Because essentially, whatever state they're in now and whether they're not as powerful as they once were, the messaging that they have managed to hone has won the day ultimately.
Exactly. And the messaging is based around the Constitution. And Republicans are very good at framing things they don't like in a constitutional term. So, for instance, when Obama introduced the Affordable Health Care Act, they immediately called it Obamacare, so it was very much identified with one guy, and it was about the infringement of the state onto your personal liberties. The state is forcing you, Kieran Woodley, to buy medical insurance. And the Democrats, including Obama himself and Nancy Pelosi, working with him in Congress, were very slow at changing the language to their favor. But the minute the Republicans couched it as an infringement on your personal liberties, which is what they've done with the Second Amendment, half the country's lost the argument.
And obviously, as you've said, there's a lot of polling around this. Straight after a shooting, there is a bit more support for some form of gun control, then it sort of recedes. But I mean, when you look at some of the main polling, 70% of Americans think enacting new gun control laws should take precedence over protecting ownership. That was according to a recent ABC News poll. What is it that Republicans are fearful of? Is it also the fact that another poll shows that 44% of Republicans say we have to live with mass shootings? I mean, are they worried about losing the NRA endorsement? Are they worried about losing the primaries and losing their position? Is gun ownership really a single issue which could, befall a Republican congressperson or senator?
It could do. I think it's a really interesting question, that actually, because I don't think they're that afraid of the NRA per se. I don't think they're that afraid of losing funding from the organizations. I think what they're afraid of is that they can't break the cycle according to which the majority of their Republican voters, and remember, most of these congressional seats are not competitive anyway. I mean, the competition is within the primaries, if anything at all. People get reelected over and over again. They're afraid that if they don't stick to the hard line on guns, they will be ousted at the next election, probably in a primary process, where someone will come along and say, I'm more of a purist on gun rights than that guy, vote for me and get rid of him. I think that's what they're afraid of. There are some sacred issues on both sides of the aisle, and for the Republicans, the most sacred of them all, because it is also the best indicator of voting intentions, is gun rights.
On the other side, for the Democrats, do they think it's a vote winner? Because when Joe Biden gave his speech, from the White House, his angry sort of, frustrated speech, and he mentioned a whole list of measures he wanted to have done, which he knows can't happen, because he himself has admitted, I have no power here. It's a 50-50 Senate. There's only so many things I can do. Is he appealing to his base there and thinking that the Democrats have a tough midterms coming up on this issue?
But he's got the base already in hand, right?
Yeah.
I think the problem is that if you look at the independents, are genuinely independent when it comes to stricter gun laws. They're marginally in favor, but not by a massive majority, right? 40% of new gun owners in the last year, and by the way, during the pandemic, gun ownership has gone through the roof. 40% are women. 35% are members of minorities, mainly Hispanic. So when even sacred Democrat turf, housewives, Hispanic minorities, these are people who vote Democrat, not Republican, and even they are buying guns because they don't feel safe anymore, then, Biden has a problem. the Democrats have a problem.
And is the problem then also, if those independents who are very important when it comes to midterms and when it comes to all elections in America, if they are erring on the side of some sort of middle ground, and that's what ultimately might come along, right? Some sort of Senate bill that doesn't please all Democrats, but it sort of appeases Republicans and everyone gets on board. Who wins out of that then? The Republicans can say that's a victory for them.
Yeah, they could. And even if there is legislation, it can just, how long for? I mean, the 1994 gun, ban on assault weapons that Bill Clinton brought in not only cost him the midterm elections that took place just a few months later. Remember the Newt Gingrich Revolution, American Revolution, whatever it was called, Republican majority that swept in and swept the Democrats from power in the House was a direct response to the gun laws that Bill Clinton brought in. A direct response. That is the kind of thing that haunts all politicians on all sides. But anyway, that was brought in, and then it was allowed to lapse in 2004 under President Bush, and it was never put in place again. So I have to say, I think long term, because America's had such a long time and has survived so many school massacres with younger and younger kids and done really nothing about it, I think it cannot be solved.
Which I think for me comes to the heart of this issue, that is, guns have been around for a long time. America's been around for more than 200 years. What's going on here? And is it ultimately, we're also at the moment seeing these hearings into January 6th, the insurrection, issues about American democracy. Is this about a problem with the American system that makes it this way? Because, we're talking about a 50-50 Senate, but we're also talking about the fact that every state gets 2 senators.
Yeah. And
the Democratic senators represent nearly 40 million more voters than the Republican senators, but they have the exact same power. And one analysis says that by 2040, 70% of Americans will live in the 15 largest states and be represented by only 30 senators, while 30% of Americans will have 70 senators.
Okay, and now you get to so that it makes no sense to us, right?
Yeah.
We sit here as sensible Europeans, we think this is just bonkers. But the system has snookered itself.
Yeah.
Because when it was first set up, for very good reasons, the smaller states were given, undue power compared to the bigger states because, these were largely agricultural states. The whole thing was based on a kind of gentleman's agreement that, it was all about checks and balances. The whole system, whether it's the checks and balances on the power of the president, the checks and balances on the majority, in the House and in the Senate, it's all designed to prevent one party from dominating all of it. Okay. So you then put all that into the magic mix of history and you add money, in when it comes to guns, you add, weapons technology that makes more and more powerful guns. You add social media more belatedly. You put it all into the mouli, and out comes a cake that is both, red on one side and blue on the other side, and there's no purple left. And that is the problem. America only really works if there's a gentleman's agreement, as there was originally designed by these very clever gentleman farmers, the founding fathers, that you respect the other side, that the winner respects the loser defers to the winner. But if you add all this together and you make it this tribal in a 50-50 nation, and you can no longer agree on who's won or lost the game of Monopoly known as the election, it's over. It's finished. Because the question with the next election will not be who's won, but will the loser accept the result?
But is this not, that system we're talking about was set up to stop the tyranny of the majority. Is this not now the tyranny of the minority in the sense that the senators have all this power despite representing fewer and fewer individuals? You then have a Supreme Court which is now majority conservative, which looks like it will, not only sort of secure gun rights, it will also get rid of Roe versus Wade, even though a majority of Americans want to keep Roe versus Wade. So when we talk about the shootings and everything, there's a fundamental issue going on with how America operates.
There is. And the thing is, the only way to solve that issue, the only way to reform it under the current rules is with a supermajority in the Senate. And that's just not going to happen, not at the moment, because it's 50-50. And even if there was a landslide in favor of, let's say the Republicans, and they wanted to change the Constitution, well, because their power, they are unduly represented in these smaller states with smaller populations, they will pass stuff, they will do things that are even more against, the majority living in the big cities and in the populous states. That's the problem. So, at some stage, I don't know what can solve this. It's a Gordian knot that cannot be untied, because the system that was set up 200 years ago, which is not that long ago, is not fit for purpose anymore today. That's the real problem here. But the minute you say that, you're attacking the Constitution. And again, the discussion is halted. Even a lot of Democrats will say, how dare you? This is the Constitution. We're the greatest nation on earth. And so, again, it comes back to something else that we've talked a lot about, the self-conscious exceptionalism of America. We are unique as a nation. The minute you think that what you have is so special, it's never existed in history before, and it is based on this on these Dead Sea Scrolls, the parchment papers of the Constitution, and despite the fact that you've also invented the iPhone and the motor car and electricity and all these other things that have made modern life possible, you keep going back to these original documents. It's a bit like the Vatican, actually, and the Bible. I mean, it is, and these are articles of faith that you cannot mess with. Under these circumstances, any kind of reasonable reform, what we in Europe would regard as reasonable reform, is almost impossible.
We started by talking about Uvalde and talking about your experience in America, and you spoke about your love fundamentally of America. Looking ahead now to the midterms, where we may most probably see the Republicans come into the House and the Senate, to 2024, another Trump run in the White House. You talked about books about civil war. Are you more worried about America and its future now than ever before?
Totally. Completely. Because I think if you cannot agree on the rules of the game, there is no game. And if you then add into that a mindset which firmly holds that the people who are against you are as different to you as people from another planet, they don't share the same values. And then you add into that mix 400 million guns in private hands, this is not a pretty picture. And so I would not be surprised at all if there was some visceral, nasty breakdown of law and order. And so, I'm hoping this never happens. But when people raised this issue 20 years ago, you'd say, oh, come off it. And now they're not saying that anymore. And again, they're even getting used to that possibility.
Matt Frei, thank you very much for talking to me.
It's a pleasure.
Today's podcast was produced by Nina Hodgson, and I'm Kieran Moodley, and you can listen to all episodes of the podcast on all good podcast apps.